This video is sponsored by the Magnet Baron. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and 10th edition Warhammer 40k has been an interesting experiment, but by all accounts, it's nearing its end, with rumors of 11th edition coming around this time next year, and previews for a new edition likely to start in early 2026. So I think it's an interesting time to go through and list what I would like to see in 11th edition in a numbered list form, from simplest and most likely changes to the more extreme requests. And let's start by talking about updated terrain rules. 9th edition had an interesting terrain system, a series of terrain keywords that could be assembled to give terrain different effects. This was largely up to the control of the players or event organizers for an event. Games Workshop did mess this mechanic up though by giving some recommended terrain keywords that events tended to stray towards. However, these were not always typically balanced, and I think soured the community against this mechanic. However, what this allowed terrain to do is it allowed terrain that is other than ruins to gain line of sight blocking effect like ruins have in 10th edition. What's been made clear over the years and years of the evolution of competitive Warhammer 40k is that the large armies of the game and the lethality of especially shooting phases in 40k means that terrain in the game that does not block line of sight or provide serious defensive benefits doesn't really matter that much and might as well not even be included, which essentially means that only terrain that has a line of sight blocking property like a ruin does in 10th edition is ever used. Now, for some reason, these keywords were removed in 10th edition in favor of the more strict system that we have now, which essentially meant that the only competitively relevant terrain in the edition is a ruin terrain feature. And this has spawned an unending whale of complaints that every terrain feature is a ruin now, and Warhammer 40k has become a soulless husk of its former self. Now, I think returning a system like these keywords would be huge. I also think that imposing line of sight restrictions or other similar defensive mechanics on terrain types that are not just ruins, such as forcing enemies to be close by to detect and target enemies that are hiding inside, for example, forested terrain. So rather than purely line of sight blocking, you could have forested terrain allow units that are within it to only be targeted by enemies that are within 12 inches, for example, which gives them a similar effect but is mechanically distinct. And this could go a long way to making these terrain features competitively relevant without necessarily making them generically line of sight blocking. I also have a whole separate video on a proposed ruin and structure rule rework that I made ages and ages ago that I still stand by. And in my opinion, it would go a long way to reduce the necessity for true line of sight. I'll discuss later in the video. But I also think it poses an interesting thought experiment for how to make things like ruins and structures behave a little bit more realistically and a little bit more simply. I will link that video down in the video description, and if I remember, I will put a card in this section. Now, for the next slide, I would like to see better bracketing rules in 11th edition. In 10th edition, Titans and Super Heavies are basically these Boolean concepts. They are either alive or they are dead. 1 or 0. There's not really a middle ground. There is a damaged mechanic in 10th edition, but it simply gives you -1 to hit. And because of how numerical modifiers work in the edition, having -1 to hit doesn't stack with other -1 to hit effects, and 90% of the time, at the time at which a vehicle is damaged, it is already suffering hit penalties, either from stealth, stratagem effects, smoke screens, or being engaged in melee. So it largely doesn't really matter. And in some cases, vehicles have inbuilt ways to ignore their own damaged attribute, which is very silly. Now, I think the system is fine for lighter vehicles, and even things up to what we would consider like heavy tanks like Rogaldords and Land Raiders is probably fine. But when we get to things like Titans and Super Heavies, it gets insane. These vehicles are able to take punishment that would destroy 2 or 3 smaller tanks and essentially receive no downgrade in their ability to inflict damage, which can make games incredibly swingy, based entirely off whether or not you could kill them from full. I would love to see a track of weapon or movement effects that progress as the vehicle loses wounds, that renders certain attacks or weapon systems inoperative. This goes a long way to curbing the power of those vehicles against armies that do not one-shot them. And it makes them more balanced in the comparison with more regular units like infantry, since infantry units of a similar value lose models as they suffer damage, and therefore weapons and attacks are removed from the pool of profiles over time. This video is brought to you by the Magnet Baron. Magnet Baron is your one-stop shop for all of your miniature magnetization needs. If you are looking to get into some of the new big stompy factions that have just released, Magnet Baron wants me to talk to you about their new no-drill magnet kits. These are kits that apply alongside large miniatures like Imperial Knight and give you replacement parts as well as magnets that allow you to utilize the entire kit, adding specialized attachments and joints that allow you to add magnets into the construction of the model, allowing you to easily swap your weapons on and off. With how fast the metagame of 10th edition Warhammer 40k changes, having flexible weapon options on your models just makes sense, and especially for these expensive vehicle and Titan kits that have a wide variety of options available to them, magnets are the way to go. So check them out at themagnetbaron.com. Links are in the video description. Big thanks to Magnet Baron for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. Now with that, let's move over to dive into some of Warhammer 40k's core mechanics and a change that I would love to see, and that is a rework to the attack structure. Now, the way that Warhammer 40k works right now is actually kind of fundamentally broken. The way that the game is played is actually not how the core engine of the game is intended to operate. The way that attacks work in Warhammer 40k is that technically they are rolled one at a time. They're each resolved independently. If you have a unit of Space Marines firing 40 times at an enemy, the way that the rules consider that attack resolving is that you are rolling 40 individual hit, wound, and saving throw rolls in that sequence. If you resolved a game of 40k like this, it would take hours, and unfortunately, it creates an endless amount of rules gray area and the necessity for really inane and annoying FAQs in order to make this system work in a way where you are rolling lots of dice all together, which is how Warhammer 40k has worked since time immemorial. In my opinion, it is imperative that this structure gets reworked in a way that is more sane. I think that attacks should be pooled together, and that the intention of the game is that attacks are resolved all simultaneously. Having to write rules and word abilities around the fact that the game considers your attacks to be rolled individually, and then also having to then FAQ those abilities to work with the fast dice rolling rules that the players actually use is ridiculous. And I think systems like Star Wars Legion, where attacks are simply pooled together that are then manipulated and affected by cover and things like that, are much more reasonable. And I would love to see a system closer to that in 11th edition. Even though I don't believe that the core engine of hit, wound, saving throw, damage roll, feel no pain is ever going to change, I do think that there are improvements that could be made on the back end. And in a similar vein, let's talk about the next slide, balanced lethality. I've had a huge issue with how weapon profiles are designed in 10th edition. At the launch of the edition, everything was very algorithmic. Compared to their profiles in 9th edition, basically every unit suffered -1 to almost all of their rolls to hit, wound, convert the attack through a saving throw, and finally inflict damage. Effects like more easily applicable cover that was introduced in 10th edition, and widespread access to defensive mechanics like Armor of Contempt or Smokescreen further reduced the effectiveness of basically any attack, and led to a real dearth of consistent damage output in many armies. If you weren't at the very upper echelon, the top crust of the competitive metagame, most armies at the release of 10th edition could not reliably kill their opponent, and there was a real crisis of damage output that, fortunately, the design team has been designing around, but it's still there lurking in the background of 10th edition. While some factions can trivially remove heavy targets with lots of rerolls, stacking buff, dice fixing effects, wound bonuses, others still struggle to consistently deal damage to even medium weight vehicles or armored infantry. I would love for these extremes to be brought closer together, especially with the more pillow-fisted armies able to more reliably interact with their opponent in combat, with access to things like more rerolls, AP buffs, ignoring cover, and more consistent attack and damage profiles. I especially think that the emphasis on random damage profiles should be removed in 11th edition. I think units toting widespread D6 or D3 damage weapons are ridiculously inconsistent on both ends of the spectrum, dealing either more or less damage than you would expect. I would love to see these weapons brought more, I would love to see basically every weapon in the game brought to a more consistent value, where you're either D3 plus a large number, or you are a flat damage value. And I would also, I think I would like to see things like feel no no pains be reduced as well, because that is a big drag on the pace of the game. When you are trying to resolve random damage weapons into units with a feel no pain, it can take minutes to resolve a single attack, and that's crazy. Now, tangential to that is also a balance of core stratagems. An interesting part of 10th edition has been its emphasis on core stratagems such as smokescreen and grenade that take what used to be a lot of mechanics that were either on datasheets or were core to a lot of factions and have brought them into the core rulebook. And I like this. I think that the standardization of mechanics is great. However, not all factions can make use of these effects, and they suffer dramatically because of it. Especially things like grenade, which is one of the only consistent sources of mortal wounds now that the psychic phase has been removed. That only being available to a certain handful of factions actually has significant balance implications that have never really been addressed. It's an ongoing joke that Xenos armies like Necrons or Tyranids don't use that section of the core rules. They basically just rip it out of the rulebook, and that sucks. So I'd like to see the power of some stratagems reduced or their effects applied more universally, with either similar effects or just a hand wave explanation as to why you can use the stratagem on factions that might not necessarily have the correct keywords in 10th edition. Now, before we move on, I want to talk about one more thing when it comes to attacks and damage in 40k, and that is I would love to see a reworked charge and fight phase. Melee combat in Warhammer 40,000 has always been dramatically underpowered compared to ranged attacks, at least from a mechanical standpoint. It's usually shored up by more impressive melee profiles than you see offensive profiles with ranged attacks, but that's not universally the case. While movement does allow you greater movement and control over the board state and objective scoring, it includes far more failure points than just sitting back and shooting your opponent with ranged attacks, and even allows enemies to attack you during your own turn, something that a ranged attack would never do. However, 10th edition has not only depowered almost every melee profile in the game, but also introduced insanely convoluted mechanics and tons of additional failure points to advancing up the table and engaging enemies in melee. In 10th edition, not only could you fail a charge, get overwatched while charging, or simply fail to kill your opponent and die on your own turn, but you can also be heroically intervened by 90% of datasheets in the game. You can be overwatched by any point during your turn, even at the beginning of your movement phase when you select a unit to move, or if you roll too high on your charge and are then forced into moving into a disadvantageous position. That is insane. First of all, I would like to see a base level to charge rolls. Charges under 6 inches should have additional insurance, such as being guaranteed successes or automatic rerolls, for example. Even a stratagem, for example, that allows you to automatically make a 6-inch charge would be huge when it comes to shoring up the consistency of melee armies, because every enfranchised player can remember a game where they rolled a Snake Eyes to charge and immediately lost, and that sucks, and in my opinion, that's just bad game design. Secondly, the rules need to be reworked to not force basing in melee. Currently, if you roll high on a charge, you could be forced to move into base contact with your charge target, and when you pile in and consolidate, you can also be forced to move into base contact or required to move into base contact if you move, and that opens up many additional failure points for melee units, like blocking out future charging units or potentially preventing your own models from getting into melee or triggering heroic interventions from your opponent. In my opinion, and this might be controversial, the pile in and consolidate rules are very archaic and they're not very required. They are a huge point of skill expression for players, but as a lot of people point out in the comment sections of my video talking about these mechanics, it's mostly about knowing that you can do particular tricks. So it's kind of a knowledge check rather than a skill check. And I don't think they really improve the gameplay of the game that much. I would love to see charges be made more consistent and just allow models that successfully charge and are within a certain distance of their target to attack, such as 6 inches away from your target. Then you just move on. No additional movement required. Removing these excess movements or toning down their requirements would also shave a considerable amount of game time and make the fight phase a little bit more parsable to a less enfranchised audience. Now with that, let's talk a little bit about list build. Something that I found lacking in 10th edition is an ability to truly explore deeper into a particular faction. In previous editions, mechanical depth could be found by playing particular sub-factions, and especially things like custom sub-factions that let you emphasize particular areas of a codex that may not be advantageous from a raw statistical standpoint. However, 10th edition's detachment system has removed almost all of that. And while I like the detachment system for the most part, I would love to overlay it with core faction effects that could cross between detachments. A good example of this is Armor of Contempt in Space Marines, where almost every single Space Marine detachment has this stratagem, why are we even printing it on the detachment anymore? You could just add it to the codex. And I think factions would be improved with greater consistency in gameplay by having one or two of these effects. In addition, I would also like to see sub-faction effects that apply maybe one or two additional stratagems and some additional enhancement options, as well as maybe an ability or two that affects particular units. Again, Space Marines are a pretty solid example of this. Already, we have Space Marine characters like Vulcan Heston who have insane bonuses for units like Infernus Marines, making Salamander's armies mechanically very distinct from regular Space Marine armies if played in a way that benefits them thematically. And I would like to see this on a more in-depth level in other factions as well. Currently, most factions in 10th edition boil down to simply playing their strongest detachment, and most detachments simply have a strongest build. Well, obviously, this is largely going to be true for a single army list game like 40k has, but my hope is that the ability to customize these factions would encourage a lot more exploration within each. And with that, we can move on to character customization, which is something that 10th edition has basically entirely removed. And I will admit my bias here, I am a huge sucker for cool character units, especially interesting combos of effects between powers, weapons, datasheet abilities, special attributes, and relic war gear. 10th edition has basically axed almost all of that, at least for competitive play, boiling down character customization to the selection of the most effective enhancement option out of a list of 4 with its single most synergistic recipient. That absolutely sucks, and I would love to return to a system closer to that of previous editions, where you have multiple layers of enhancement options that can be added to a character to synergize together. If you also include some more customizable character datasheet abilities, so that, for example, not every Space Marine captain is an identical little man, I think that the game would be much improved by more interesting character dynamics. Next up, let's talk about some core mechanics. The first one being true line of sight. I hate it, and I think it should go away. In my opinion, line of sight should be a measurement that is traced across the across the battlefield between two models' bases. If that line crosses over something determined to be line of sight blocking, the line of sight is blocked. Otherwise, you have it. So, for example, certain terrain features could be, or miniatures could be classified as line of sight blocking to the model trying to see around them. If they are, and you can't draw a line between the two models' bases that doesn't cross over those things, then line of sight would be blocked. However, if there is an unobstructed line, then you have line of sight. Simple as that. Get rid of verticality, get rid of the miniature counting for line of sight, get rid of all of that stuff. We need to remove the ability of models to gain line of sight to and from random parts of their physical miniature, since it creates immense amount of rules baggage that has to be explained about exactly how this works, especially alongside 2D line of sight measurement for things like ruins, and I've made tons of videos about it. I've had to answer endless questions about it. It creates unintuitive interactions and insane negative play experiences, where it turns out one model can trace a tiny iota of line of sight from their left wing to the end of a sword, which means suddenly your unit might immediately die. That sucks. And what's wild is that 40k is one of the only remaining games in the industry that uses this incredibly outdated mechanic. If I were to don my tinfoil hat, I'd posit that Games Workshop wants to encourage communities to play exclusively with the official models to accurately represent and trace line of sight. But this is also directly contrary to the company's ever-present push towards kit bashing and customization. And I also have some solutions to some of the stickier points in my next slide. Now, with the obscuring terrain rule in 9th edition and the ruined terrain rule in 10th edition, Warhammer has been steadily moving towards a true line of sight less system, and I think we are eventually going to get there. 11th edition may be the time, but I just don't know. Alongside that comes a question about units that don't have bases, and that's why I think we need a better system of hull measurement. Hull measuring models are units like tanks and vehicles in Warhammer 40k, and currently, they have tons of mechanical issues that stifle gameplay, such as line of sight being traced true and from random gun barrels or antenna, cosmetic elements attached to the miniature, preventing models from moving around terrain because suddenly they become too wide, or weapon ranges being drawn to an extended weapon barrel rather than the hull of the vehicle itself. Well, I'd like to see all models placed on bases, and those bases, as I mentioned before, used solely for line of measurement and line of sight purposes, where the miniature miniature on the base simply representing the game piece rather than having mechanical baggage of its own, I recognize that this is a huge logistical issue for a game that has gone 40 years without using bases on its vehicles. A happy medium would be to define a specific area of each hull measuring miniature that represents its hull. This could be done in a simple diagram on the model's datasheet or hosted online, and then projection measurement is used to and from that area on the tabletop. Projection measurement is essentially a system by which the model's base, for all intents and purposes, is simply counted as the area of the battlefield that's directly underneath that model. You look from the top of the model down and you measure to only that top-down silhouette. This could then allow vehicles to only treat their core areas as being gameplay relevant. For example, a Lehman Russ could only treat its hull area, not its sponson weapons or turret-mounted cannon, as the model's base for the purposes of gameplay. This allows you more flexibility with modeling and positioning additional pieces. You could then swing your turrets and sponson mounts around during gameplay to be more thematic and look cooler. You could even go even farther and specify a front of the vehicle that's required for the direction of movement to then encourage vehicle placement to work more thematically, rather than the oodles of backwards driving tanks we've been dealing with in the game for years. Now with that, I'd like to see a return of the psychic phase, but different. In my opinion, and I recognize my bias here because basically all of my favorite armies are psychic heavy, I don't think the removal of the psychic phase did 40k any favors. Factions that relied heavily on it for reliable damage or unique buffs ended up feeling underbaked and ridiculously pillow-fisted on release, with lots of synergy between their datasheets and abilities suddenly wildly absent. The excuse that was used that the psychic phase also made gameplay slower is, to be candid, largely bullshit, since it maybe only added 10 to 15 minutes of gameplay to the game, whereas changes in recent editions otherwise, such as alternating deployments and the introduction of tactical secondary decks, have added so much more time. Games in 10th edition are wildly longer than they were in 9th edition, despite the fact that 9th edition had a very in-depth psychic phase mechanic. However, I do recognize that factions not being allowed to participate in that particular phase sucks, and in my opinion, that's just a symptom of poor game design. There should be no factions in the game that have no interaction in a particular phase. This even goes as far as to say that I don't think, for example, Tau should have literally no melee presence outside of some select auxiliary units. I think that every faction should have the option to include units that interact with any particular part of the game that they want, even if dominance in that particular phase might not be part of the faction's color pie. With all that in mind, what I'd like to see is a more generic, they call it incantations phase, where armies can use psychic and psychic adjacent abilities. This could include things like plasmancer damage, litanies issued by chaplains, and incantations evoked by ethereals that could be rolled together with similar mechanics and all resolved during this phase, giving basically all actions ways to interact with it and a greater breadth of list building opportunities with the inclusion of such abilities. Now with that, let's get into some more esoteric stuff. One of the biggest changes I'd like to see in 9th edition is a rework to the setup of the game and determining who goes first versus second. Both 9th edition and 10th edition have had a huge first versus second problem, with mission design playing a huge role in who wins based on whether they win or lose the role to go first. While 8th edition oftentimes got simply resolved by the pure damage output, where the team going first got the first opportunity to shoot at their opponent and kill their units, which oftentimes meant that they win, the introduction of more modern terrain and scenario systems in 9th and 10th edition flipped this on its head. For a while in 9th edition, first player was stronger because they had the first opportunity to score points and they could dictate the tempo of the game. This was then reworked with bottom round 5 scoring towards the late end of 9th edition and all the way through 10th edition, which has kind of thrown that balance back in the favor of the player going second, to the point that at the stage we are in 10th edition right now, the player going second has a massive advantage in almost every situation. Now, in my opinion, the best way to balance this dichotomy in the future is by determining first versus second before deployment. This was done in 8th edition, and it allowed you to construct your game plan before the game began, knowing which player went first versus which player went second. First of all, this cuts down the total game time played by probably 20 minutes, since the alternating deployment mechanic used in the current edition is ridiculously time-consuming. And this is probably one of the biggest ways that you can save time when it comes to playing a game of 40k. But the other interesting benefit that this gives you is it allows you to impose specific mechanics on the player going first versus second that you cannot do otherwise if the players have to deploy not knowing who is taking the first turn. This allows you to, for example, change the position of objectives on the battlefield based on which player's deployment zone is the first player. You could shift them towards the second player's deployment zone and construct terrain layouts to adapt to that. In addition, or alternatively, you could also just change the size of the deployment zones, with the first player having to deploy significantly farther back from the second player, and the second player gaining more table presence because they are going second. Now, it goes without saying, but this is assuming that the mission mechanics undergo a total overhaul. But if they do, things like deployment zone size, objective placement, the order of scoring, terrain features on the battlefield, and an infinity of other mechanics could be tweaked slightly to keep first versus second more balanced. And in my opinion, this change is a no-brainer. And also makes for some deeper gameplay, since instead of just gambling whether you're going first or second, which often happens in the current edition of the game, you are able to construct a game plan from the very first turn. Now let's get a little esoteric and talk about deterministic mechanics, something that I would like to see reworked in Warhammer 40k. I have a big issue with hugely impactful mechanics that only resolve on a random die roll, which is something that the designers of Warhammer 40k absolutely love. Examples of this are things like characters that only respawn back to life on the result of a leadership test, psychic powers whose effects are only applied on the roll of a 2+, and even rare effects that happen randomly, such as vehicle explosions. These are random and can wildly swing the game one way or another. And while I admit that in the case of explosions, they're sometimes fun to watch, they are much less fun to get blown out by, especially if these effects have no way to make themselves more likely, such as allowing players to command reroll them or giving them a stratagem to reroll those effects. It simply feels bad to both players when their abilities fail or they get blown out by a random dice roll. Since one player doesn't get to use their rules, if, for example, you have an ability that works on a 2+ and you roll a 1, your army is then significantly less affected, and the other player doesn't get experience of playing against an army that's working as it's intended. I'd like to see these effects be made more deterministic. Effects that occur on a 2+ should, in my opinion, always occur with no rule required. While I understand the rationale behind making these effects random, I don't necessarily agree with it, and I think that the times where a player is able to come back into a game because their opponent's abilities did not work for a turn are much rarer than the times that a player simply didn't roll their special abilities to work and felt really bad about it. The much more random effects should either, in my opinion, be removed or be more consistent but with a lessened impact. You could even recontextualize things like vehicle explosions by weapon type, for example. Certain weapons could cause or prevent vehicle explosions when they destroy such targets, allowing both players to interact with the mechanic in an interesting way. This mechanic already slightly exists in 40k, with some weapons making deadly demise results more reliable, but you could simply make that an ability of some weapons. A high explosive weapon or an incendiary weapon that cooks off the ammunition cache of a vehicle it shoots at could automatically cause vehicles to detonate. However, a random weapon or even a melee attack punching the vehicle in the side and ripping the crew out, it wouldn't have the same effect. But with that, those are all my thoughts about 11th edition and my wish list of mechanics I would like to see brought into the new edition. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about this wish list, if you have any wishes for 11th edition, and how you have felt about 10th edition. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon, patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.